The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Before we get into tonight's stories, we'd like to say thank you to all of you that have bought merch on our TeePublic store. We really appreciate it, and every bit of that money goes directly back into our operating expenses.
It does, and if you'd like to support the show, but money is a little tight right now, we totally get that. But there is a way to show your support that doesn't actually cost you anything. You could give us a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It may not seem like that much to you, but it makes a huge difference to us.
That it does. And also, if you haven't already, check out our premium bonus episodes. They're only $3 each.
It's a deal.
It is a deal. So, I guess with that said, let's get into tonight's stories, Beth. Why don't you tell everyone where your mind wandered for this episode?
All right. So, on March 2nd, 1978, an elderly woman passed away at the Queenswood East Nursing Home in Morton, Illinois. The woman had spent most of her adult life in state institutions, and since she had no known relatives, she was cremated by the state, and her ashes were still held by the state a year after her death. It's sad, but what's even sadder is that the elderly woman was only known as Mary Doefour. No one knew where she had been born or even what year she had been born, so they had no idea how old she was when she passed away. And as I had said, she also had no known relatives. And Mary Doefour wasn't even her real name. No one actually knew her real name. When the details of her death arrived on Bloomington Pantagraph reporter Rick Baker's desk, the man was bothered by just how vague it all was. Something told him he needed to look into the story a little bit more. So most of what I'm going to share about Mary Doefour comes from the many, many articles that Baker wrote about her. But I found these articles on various secondary sites, and I have to say that compiling it all was quite a task. So I don't usually do this up front, but I'd like to cite all of the sources just so that I don't have to keep referring back and forth every, couple of seconds to where it came from. So there's only 4 of them. So there's the Daily Sentinel out of Woodstock, Illinois, which was published on Thursday, March 15th, 1979 on page 7. Reporter finds woman's identity 50 years too late. There was a Medium article, One in the Same, The Haunting Tale of Mary Doefour and One Man's Quest to Give Her Back Her Real Name by Lucy C., March 2020. A Gazette article, Time Machine, What Happened to Missing Teacher by Diane Fannin Langdon, published on November 30th, 2022, and AncestrySistersBlogspot.com. So, again, I don't usually do that up front, but I wanted to give them credit instead of, like I said, switching back and forth every couple of seconds of where this stuff comes from. So, on March 15th, 1979, the Daily Sentinel in Woodstock, Illinois, reran an article Rick Baker had previously published. In the article, he said that 50 years earlier, in either 1926 or 1928, an attractive young woman was found wandering along a road in northern Illinois. She seemed dazed, and the only information she was able to share about herself was that she had been a teacher somewhere in the Midwest. When they first found her wandering, Mary, who was described as having blue eyes and standing taller than average, had been very badly beaten, and she was a victim of rape. Even though she hadn't committed any crime, and she came across as both articulate and witty, her inability to recall any information about herself meant that she was placed in a hospital for the criminally insane in Manteno. It was there that they began to refer to her as Mary Doe. Initially, Mary was fairly articulate. She would try to talk with the nursing staff and tell them the bits and pieces that she remembered of her own life. For example, that part about her being a teacher. She distinctly remembered working with small children, so she guessed it was first or second grade. She also came across as very well educated herself. But the staff at the time, well, they didn't really listen. They may have assumed she was making things up as part of a delusion. According to the Ancestry Sisters website, Mary gave birth soon after arriving at the hospital. Rick Baker assumed that she probably never saw her own child before it was likely put up for adoption. She was treated horribly and humanely at the hospital in other ways as well. She never received any kind of therapy to help her remember her life, and when she became upset and tried to insist that she was not insane, she was heavily drugged. So much so that the articulate and witty young woman spent most of her time in a comatose state, to the point that she actually developed pseudo-Parkinson's disease, which she exhibited for the rest of her life. She was also frequently subjected to electroshock treatments, to the point that they actually knocked her out. She was then placed in an ice bath to make her come to again. When she was lucid, her amnesia became even worse than before. After a decade at Manteno, she was transferred to the state mental hospital in Bartonsville. Except there were already 3 Mary Does in the state system. So, as a way to distinguish her from the others, she became known as Mary Doefour. See, when I read it initially, I thought her last name was Doefour.
So I bet there were 3 other Mary Does before her.
Right.
So that's what the 4 is all about.
Right. So it was Mary Doe,
yeah.
Mary Doe 2, Mary Doe 3, and Mary Doe 4. Mary's ability to take care of herself quickly diminished at Bartonsville, mostly due to the conditions there. Her room didn't have a toilet, and since there were only 1 nurse for every 150 patients, Mary often was forced to relieve herself on the floor in her room. When she was brought to the bathroom, there was only a toilet. There was no sink. So she would try to wash herself in the toilet water, and she frequently blew her nose on her dress. And like most of the patients, she continued to receive electroshock therapy. She spent 30 years in Bartonsville. In 1972, when Bartonsville was shut down, Mary was transferred to a nursing home in El Paso, and then finally to Morton. 5 years later, in 1977, she went blind. So you can see why Rick Baker felt like he needed to give this woman her name back. According to an article at Medium.com titled One and the Same, The Haunting Tale of Mary Doefour, and One Man's Quest to Give Her Back Her Real Name, the Pantograph published Baker's obituary for Mary just 10 days after her death, and Baker really hoped that one of the 50,000 readers of the newspaper might know something. But no one did. 9 months later, Baker joined the staff at the Peoria Journal-Star. He hadn't really forgotten about Mary Doefour, and time was running out before the state would have to bury her remains. So he asked for his story to be run again. This time, even bigger papers in other parts of the country picked up his article and ran it too. And still, nothing. Until one day, Baker received a letter postmarked from Iowa. The writer, a lady from Mount Vernon, Iowa, wondered if Mary Doefour might be a missing school teacher who disappeared from her area back in the 1930s. She couldn't remember the young lady's name, but she thought it might be Alice Zeiser. Baker tracked down the number of the one and only elementary school he could find in Mount Vernon, and he spoke with a secretary there, asking if she'd ever heard any town lore about a teacher who had gone missing 40 or 50 years earlier. She hadn't, but she said she'd ask around. The secretary called back a few days later with a slightly different name, Alice Zeiser. Plus, she had the number of someone who might even remember Alice, an elderly man named Harry. When Baker got a hold of him, Harry did indeed remember the missing schoolteacher, but her name wasn't Alice Zeiser, it was Anna Merle Zeiser. But Harry insisted that Mary Doefour couldn't possibly be Anna Zeiser because everyone knew that poor Anna had been murdered. Except Baker didn't stop digging, and it turned out blue-eyed and light brown-haired Anna Merle Zeiser had never actually been found. According to the Gazette article, Anna Merle alternated between studying at Cornell University and teaching either first or second grade between 1924 and 1926. She was incredibly intelligent and ambitious, wanting to finish her degree. But she was also close to her family, traveling home to visit them almost every weekend. She enrolled in a summer school program in Boulder, Colorado in 1926, before returning to her classroom as a teacher. She was 28 years old. On November 5th, 1926, Anna dressed in a green and gray plaid coat and a black hat, and carrying an overnight bag, withdrew $10 from her bank account just like always, and boarded the train to Mount Vernon with a fellow teacher named Catherine Turner. Except Anna told Turner that she wasn't actually going home that weekend, and that she had something else to do. And she got off at the Marion Station, a suburb of Cedar Rapids. When Anna didn't come into school on Monday, her aunt, who was named Alice Zeiser, called Anna's parents to see if she was home with them. She wasn't. There was a pretty big search effort to find her. The Gazette ran a photo of her, and radio stations from Cedar Rapids to Iowa City ran bulletins about her disappearance along with her description. Boy Scouts and Cornell College students volunteered to search for her. Boaters glided up and down the Cedar River looking. The mayor of Mount Vernon hired a private investigator. Anna's family hired private investigators, and police followed every lead they were given. Like one woman claimed to have seen a young woman of Anna's description wandering around the streets of Cedar Rapids rather erratically. At one point, she simply stood in the middle of the street. Or the police officer who spotted a young woman wandering down Route 30 about 75 miles from Cedar Rapids. Or the dozen or so witnesses who claimed to see Anna all along Route 30, stopping in a truck with an unidentified man at various hotels. Anna, they said, looked seriously ill. Or one man, George W. Penn, who called in to say that Anna had been pregnant, and although he'd offered to marry her, she had refused. He was adamant that the child was not his, but that he had wanted to marry her anyway. Police searched medical records for dozens of hospitals, but found nothing. Or the person who saw a woman matching her description wandering around downtown Chicago. The first and only suspects in Anna's disappearance weren't questioned until January of 1928. A couple named Eva and Dr. Jesse Cook had been charged with second-degree murder in the death of a pregnant 19-year-old girl. The couple, who performed a botched abortion on the girl, just happened to have been in Cedar Rapids the same weekend Anna Sizer got off the train and disappeared. Dr. Cook denied ever having seen Anna at all. No evidence was found. After 7 years, Anna's brother George Sizer began the proceedings to release her assets to the family. And, in a very strange coincidence, the Harry that Rick Baker had talked to on the phone about Anna Merle Sizer just happened to be her other brother, Harry Sizer. Now, Baker couldn't help it. He had to wonder, was Anna Merle Sizer, who was allegedly last seen in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, be the same woman who had stumbled along the road in Illinois? Was Mary Doefour actually Anna Sizer? Baker theorized that Anna had met a man in Cedar Rapids who agreed to bring her to see Dr. Cook. The procedure had likely gone wrong, and the man, after driving Anna around from hotel to hotel, hoping that she would get better, had simply left her in Chicago to wander the streets in both physical and emotional distress until she was picked up and brought to the first of many institutions. Baker did his due diligence, having experts compare photos of Anna Sizer to Mary Doefour. The resemblance was uncanny. He was even able to determine that both women had similar scars in the exact same spot. Baker desperately wanted to know if he was right. All he needed was access to Mary Doefour's medical records, and all he needed in order to get that was help from Anna's brother, Harry. If Harry would go to court with him and attest that he believed Mary Doefour was his long-lost sister, then the state would release them. But Harry said no. He said that his sister's disappearance was the worst thing his family had ever had to endure, and that it tore them apart, and that after 50 years, he had finally made peace with the story that he'd allowed himself to believe, that his sister had died 50 years earlier. He didn't want to go through all of that pain all over again. And so, the story ends. Harry Sizer passed away in 1979, and Anna Sizer's last remaining sibling, her sister, passed away in 1988. Rick Baker died from injuries due to a car accident in 1988 as well. Mary Doefour's ashes were buried under a fir tree in the Morton Cemetery on March 8, 1979, in a plot reserved for people with no known relatives. Hey, did you know? It's probably no secret that we get the word lunacy from luna, the Greek word for the moon. Most hospital nurses and classroom teachers will probably swear it's true. People act out when the moon is full. Some people even speculate that since the human body is made up of mostly water, and the moon's gravitational pull is what gives our oceans their tides, then it stands to reason that a full moon affects human behavior. But many scientific studies, some going back as far as 30 years ago, have clearly debunked the myth. In a recent study in the UK, researchers looked at one hospital's ER admittance rates and reasons for a 2-year period, coinciding with all 4 phases of the moon. What did they find? Absolutely nothing. Just like every other study that's been done to try and prove there's a link. Who'da thunk it? So where did your mind wander for this episode?
Well, for those of you out there who don't already know, I love Victorian homes. The pitched roofs, wraparound front porches, cylindrical turrets, ornate windows, the roof towers and slate shingles, and their interiors, well, I could just go on and on. The craftsmanship that went into building these from the inside out is truly amazing, and it just hits some inner note with me. For me, seeing them is like listening to a song that just gives you that sensation that fills your inner being. Now, you take all that and combine it with some colorful family history, and maybe throw in some rumors of paranormal activity, and who could ask for anything more? So tonight, for my story, I'm delving into a gorgeous Victorian mansion. There are few historic homes in the U.S. as lovingly restored as the 134-year-old Mowat Fowler Mansion in Denver, Colorado. It was gorgeous when it was first built, and it's still gorgeous now, but for a long time, it sat completely abandoned. Originally a single-family home, the brick Queen Anne-style mansion was broken into tiny apartments during the mid-20th century, before falling into complete disrepair and being condemned by the city. Although it was once known as the site of a horrible double murder in 1970, the fully restored building is now a beautifully renovated bed and breakfast called the Lumber Baron Inn and Gardens. Whether you're relaxing in a deep armchair in front of the many fireplaces or being mesmerized by the numerous ornate painted ceilings, the Lumber Baron Inn is just beautiful. But if you happen to feel a slight chill, even though it's in the middle of the summer, don't worry. You're not the first, and you probably won't be the last, because many other people claim to have felt it also. Homeowners and guests have heard footsteps and claim to felt the presence of someone standing over them. And paranormal investigators, well, they claim to have caught EVPs related to that double murder. Visitors and employees have also claimed to hear phantom voices and to have seen the apparition of a woman in a flapper's dress wandering around the grand ballroom. There are reports of people taking photographs and then finding strange anomalies in the photos when they look at them later. There are 5 spirits that are believed to haunt the Lumber Baron Inn, and as always, looking at the history of the house could give us some clues into who they once were. Scottish immigrant John Mowat was vice president of the Northside Building and Loan Company and owner of the Mowat Lumber Company in the late 1800s. In the 4 years between 1889 and 1892, his company built over 200 homes in North Denver. Mowat, who was incredibly wealthy, began building his own 9,000-square-foot home in Potter Highlands neighborhood of North Denver for his wife and 5 children in 1890. He used a different kind of wood in every room of his house, including oak, cherry, sycamore, poplar, walnut, and maple. He spared no expense in hiring craftsmen to carve numerous rosettes into the dining room woodwork and to add elaborate carvings to the fireplaces in every room. And there were a lot of rooms in the 4-story home, including 7 bedrooms and 10 bathrooms. He also commissioned elaborately decorated ceilings, like the 20-foot-high pyramid ceiling in the grand ballroom on the 3rd floor. The ceilings are unique in every single room, and in all of the rooms, well, they're wallpapered in intricate patterns and bright colors. Now, the lore is that Mowat and his family only lived in the mansion for 4 years because he lost his fortune when the price of silver drastically fell, and that he left Denver a penniless man. But thankfully, this is just lore. it doesn't seem as though the Mowat family suffered any tragedies while living in the mansion. John Mowat actually lived in the home until he retired in 1906 and moved to San Diego, still relatively wealthy. Soon after, the mansion was converted into classrooms and dorm rooms for the Denver Business University. The massive home was then purchased by the Fowler family around 1912, and although it's difficult to narrow down who exactly in the Fowler family bought it, some sources say that it was Hiram Fowler, a man who made a good chunk of money in the mining business. He apparently was a quite generous man with his wealth, and he opened up a grand ballroom for neighborhood children to come play in. But other sources don't mention Hiram at all, or even suggest that he ever existed, and it's just part of the local lore as well. Other sites say that it was a man named James Fowler who bought the house in 1912. He was a known communist who believed a house that was so grand and so big should be shared by many families, not just one family. So it was used as an apartment building as early as the 1930s. And as far as I can tell, the house remained in the Fowler family for many, many years. But as the neighborhood became less swanky and the price of maintaining the mansion became too much, it was broken up even further into more apartments in the 1940s. There were now 23 tiny apartments inside its walls. Unfortunately, by 1970, the Mowat Fowler mansion was in really bad shape. The neighborhood was a popular spot for drug users and runaways, and the once opulent house was a prime place for squatters. Those who did pay rent were charged $48 to $96 a month for a single room. The average rent for a multi-room apartment in Denver that year was $110. The ballroom was still a great spot for holding parties, except the parties it was seeing now were mostly filled with illegal drug use. One teenage runaway who rented a room, known as the Valentine Room, was Cara Lee Kanoki. In 1970, she reconciled with her parents, and she spent her 17th birthday at home with them. She promised that in just 4 days, she would move back home permanently, go back to school, and hold down a job. It was October 11th. Later that night, around 9 p.m., 18-year-old Mary Ann Weaver stopped by the mansion to visit Cara. She walked in on a horrific scene. Cara was being strangled to death by a man. Whether Cara or Mary Ann knew the assailant isn't known, but the man then shot and killed Mary Ann execution style.
Jesus, and they were young.
They were very young. 2 days later, on October 13th, 1970, the bodies of both Mary Ann and Cara were discovered in the room. Cara was found underneath the bed. She had been strangled and raped. Mary Ann, well, she was found on the floor with her hands folded over her chest. The double murder was instantly front-page news, and J.H. Fowler, who owned the house at the time, was allegedly quoted as saying to one of the newspaper reporters that Cara was to blame for her own death because she was a hippie.
Jeez.
That's pretty sickening.
Wow.
The murderer was never caught, although for a while there was some speculation that the crimes were committed by serial killer Vincent Groves, a man who had killed 9 women in the Denver area in the decade between 1978 and 1988. There's also speculation that Groves may have killed as many as 20 women, but since he died in 1996, there's no way to prove it. Police, however, did eventually rule him out in this case because he was only 16 years old in 1970. By 1990, the mansion was abandoned and condemned. But thankfully, it was bought by teacher, house flipper, and actor Walter Keller on April Fool's Day in 1991 for $80,000. Over the span of 4 years, Keller painstakingly restored the mansion back into its original floor plan and filled it with antique furniture. It was while he was renovating that he had a strange experience. It was one evening in 1993, and Keller was in the hallway between the honeymoon suite and the Valentine Room, which happened to be Cara Kanoki's former apartment. Keller was cutting tile for a bathroom when he suddenly felt as though someone was standing closely behind him. He turned around, fully expecting to see someone, but there wasn't anyone there. Suddenly, a gust of chilled air rushed past him. Although he never specifically said that he thought it was Kara's ghost, he did say in one article that I read that he had always wanted to solve the 1970 murder case, and that he wanted nothing more than answers for the two girls' families. And there are also several accounts of people sensing that both Kara and Mary Ann are still there. They hear footsteps moving around the Valentine room, and in the hallway just outside the room, and on the staircase. People have reported feeling full-bodied chills that they can't explain, and some have even reported seeing an apparition of a young girl in the room. They assumed it was Kara. Many paranormal groups have tried to lend a hand in solving the murder case, asking questions of the spirits in the house while running digital voice recorders. One group of paranormal investigators allegedly caught multiple EVPs on 2 separate occasions, which were a year apart from each other, in which several different voices said the same name in connection to the double murder. This was back in 2011 and 2012, and as of today, their murders are still unfortunately unsolved. Once the mansion was opened up as the Lumber Baron Inn, Keller and his wife held various parties and events, including murder mystery dinners in their newly renovated ballroom. And at some point, other spirits made themselves known. According to hauntedhouses.com, one employee was in the ballroom stacking chairs after an event when he heard someone moving around in the back corner. He knew that his wife was the only other person in the house at the time, so when he looked over and saw a woman walking away from him for a split second, he went to see what she needed. He finally found his wife several floors down in the kitchen. She insisted that she hadn't come upstairs at all. Others have gotten a better look at the woman in the ballroom and describe her as wearing a flapper-style dress from the 1920s. If so, then she would most likely be from when the Fowlers owned the mansion. A fourth female spirit seen in the house is of a black woman in a maid's uniform. When people see her, they say that she appears to be going about her daily chores. But then there's also a male apparition that people have been seeing, smoking a pipe and wandering the first floor. They say that they can smell the tobacco from his pipe very strongly. Now, since he tends to give off an authoritative vibe, and based on his clothing, some speculate that he is John Mowat. But others believe that since the man's disembodied voice is heard all over the first floor, and he seems to wander from room to room, that he might be a former teacher from the days when the business school was housed in the building. Although there isn't a lot of information known about any of these 5 spirits who are said to still linger in the Lumber Baron Inn, they do tend to be relatively active. Walter Keller and his wife sold the inn to Joel and Elaine Bryant in 2016. They've continued to make the Lumber Baron Inn and Gardens a lovely spot for travelers, overnight guests, and wedding parties. In 2017, they began serving a Scottish-themed menu in the inn's restaurant, paying homage to Mowat and Elaine's own heritage. The inn does offer magical tea sessions, where guests can receive a tarot card reading while enjoying their afternoon tea. And they also have an annual Titanic dinner, where they recreate the 12-course dinner that was served to the first-class passengers aboard the Titanic. They don't advertise any sort of haunted tours on their website, and maybe that's a good thing. The inn is just absolutely beautiful, and it seems to be focusing on the positive things that happen there these days, like weddings and anniversaries, those kind of things. And perhaps that's the right thing to do, so that the spirits of Kara and Mary Ann, if they are still there, aren't asked to relive their last moments over and over. And hopefully, with some luck, someday very soon, their cases will be solved and their spirits will be at rest.
That would be good.
You know what I like about this place? Yes, it had some horrific tragedies, but it fell into disrepair and it became abandoned. And the nice thing is that somebody actually took the time to bring it back, because it cost a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Because most these days, these places would just be demolished.
Right. Yeah. I mean, his initial investment of $80,000 seemed like not much to spend on a 9,000 square foot house, but
not at all.
The money that had to be poured into it to get it back to where it is now.
Well, that's the thing. You see these all over the internet. These homes that are just massive, and they're like, $50,000 to $100,000, but it literally takes millions to bring them back because you just can't get the craftsmanship these days.
Right.
You just can't do it.
Well, kudos to Keller for doing that then. That's really cool. I think, like you said, that needs to be done with more houses.
Yeah.
And hopefully, like you said as well, the case of Kara and Marianne will be solved, that they'll find something. Somebody will come forward and say something.
Yeah. And, I hate to see them turn into these huge apartment places also. But I guess that is a good thing because at least they are still standing. They're preserved somewhat.
It kept the building standing.
Yeah. We know here that so many of the Victorian homes are gone. They've just been demolished. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode, Beth.
Yes, if you'd like to know more, as always, you can check our sources in our show notes for more information.
Join us next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.